Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Ryan Cooper.
And I'm Alexei the Greek. And we're very pleased today to have Natasha Lennard here, a columnist, journalist, and author who's been published in The Nation and The Intercept, Esquire, the list goes on, an activist, a wonderful person as far as I can tell from the beautiful writing that she's done, and a friend and colleague of former guest of the pod, Brad Evans, as well, who she worked with on the book on violence last year, excellent book, and has a new book out that everyone should read because it's a really beautiful series of essays called Being Numerous, Living an Anti-Fascist Life, that I believe was composed over several years, maybe 4 years, and yet seemingly brings together beautiful, in-the-moment responses to kind of the terrors of late capitalism with the kind of beautiful responses that hopefully we can all collectively have to better face the ravages of capitalism and fascism. So welcome, Natasha.
Oh, what a lovely introduction. Thank you for having me. Hello.
So, and I failed to mention that you also studied philosophy at Cambridge, if I'm not incorrect.
I did. Yeah. I don't usually open with that, but I suppose I think my voice is sort of posh enough that I can't really hide anyway. No. But yeah, I did. My background's in really dry analytic philosophy. But that speaks all the better to your essays, right? Because, I don't know, Ryan, what did you think? I found it a delightful mix of the political, the theoretical, from Vidal Sassoon to Foucault and Arendt, right? Judith Butler, Agamben, but also in the kind of writing that you just feel immersed in and that you could read at the beach. So that's quite an accomplishment, and our nerdy listeners, I'm sure, will love it. Yeah, take it to the beach, guys.
Fight the fascists at the beach, right?
Exactly.
Don't hesitate to use that posh voice, because Americans, as we all know, are very vulnerable to the British accent. So that gives you a key leg up in the influencer marketplace.
Oh yeah, I don't think I would have had really any career at all. Except if when I was a young blogger at Salon, they'd be put her on TV. It's English. But yeah,
I would say that, but you can't. You can't. Everyone's got their advantages and disadvantages, and you just got to run with it.
Yeah, it's one of those balances of check your privilege or weaponize your privilege.
Weaponize your privilege, absolutely. Draw them in, right? Seduce people with the beautiful posh language, and then hit them with the anti-fascist philosophy. That's the key. I love it. I noticed that, which I think this might be the first time I've come across, at least in recent years, the use of Wittgenstein, whom I love, in crafting both an analysis of our kind of contemporary capitalist fascist ideologies and problems, as well as kind of a recourse to how not to respond and how to respond. So I also saw that you have a tattoo of the duck rabbit on your arm.
I do.
You want to talk about, tell our listeners a bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, always love a tattoo story. No, so this is one of the things I did take away from my analytic philosophy background. So Ludwig Wittgenstein is, usually and rightly known as a philosopher of logic and language, and he is, he's not kind of explicitly political in any of his work, but the way in which his later work focuses on the consensus-based, movable and messy ways we make meaning in the world, I think leaves a kind of really important opening and, in fact, a kind of demand for reckoning with that kind of collective action and the ethics therein. That, if the world isn't pre-organized in categories with rules as rails as to how meaning works and what we name what, and we have to do that work together, and power plays a role therein, that's political work. Even if Wittgenstein didn't make that explicit, I see his work as really political in that sense. And when it comes to the question of fascism and how he's relevant to that, I'm not actually the first person to conjure him. Umberto Eco in the 90s in trying to give a definition for what he called fascism, he made the point, which I wish more people kind of remembered, it's not that long ago, that we might want to deploy Wittgenstein's notion of the family resemblance language game of naming. And so Wittgenstein used the example of a game. So I can't give you one complete, solid definition of the term, the concept game, that for any possible example, that definition would work, right? Like tennis has 2 players and a ball, football has 2 teams, but does that mean there have to be more than one person? No, you can play like solitaire against yourself. And I think you keep going and realize that we use the word game really sensibly. Like, we're not mad when we use it. We're able to use it, even though it doesn't have this kind of bounded definition. What we're dealing with is this kind of overlapping, connective Venn diagram of sets of things, that different things we might want to call game share, but they don't all share all of those aspects. So we might think about fascism the same way and stop asking for this, is it fascist, is it not, what's the definition, is Trump a fascist, and realize that actually this should function as a kind of unbounded concept and assemblage of, you know, authoritarianism, nationalism, misogyny, transphobia, racism, all of which can be like kind of moving round and part of the equation, but don't all have to be there all at once for us to call a phenomenon fascist. And I think having that unbound concept that still has usefulness allows us to, you know, be ethical about it and be like, well, what should we be calling fascist? What does it mean to call something fascist? If we call something fascist, that kind of implies this phenomenon deserves an anti-fascist response. What does that look like? And so I think that sort of interrogation is much more useful than this kind of flood of commentary that we've had in the past few years of like, is X fascist or not? Like, that doesn't seem to leave a lot of room for thinking philosophically and usefully about what fascism even means.
No, that's beautiful. I think that's so true. It's a form of knowledge despite not having the ability to pin it down in an essence, or, you know, that has essential features that you can reduce it to. And this seems to be a theme in your book generally about how to respond to some of the complexities of the problems that we have. You know, insofar as we can still know fascism and then think, as you say, about, you know, the meaning is in the use and the context. So let's think through how we are using politically, or what discussions are we having? Because you get into later on with rights discourse and the law and the state. What work is being done by our fixation on whether it's civility discourse or rights? So I think there's a beautiful through line here that through Wittgenstein you kind of, and I saw that the ghost essay was beautiful, and I thought like Wittgenstein's presence was kind of haunting the book as well, it seemed to me. This notion that these forms of life, these ethical practices politically that we involve ourselves in, if we just think what we are doing, to use an Arendtian term, right, we can then not fixate so much on the reduction, on the essence, and think more about who we want to be, what's real and what we can know that makes us live together well.
Right, it's like well put, you know, and I think that's why I kind of like thinking in the same vein of a lot of these phenomena in terms of not kind of nouns but gerund verbs. Like, what is fascisting? Because that like plays into more like you're saying, what work does this set of phenomena and the people that take up these practices and tendencies and how they flourish, like what work does it do in the world? Do we want to be giving that space and fostering it, or do we want to be shutting it down? And I think sometimes when you're thinking of things in sort of verb form rather than static objects, it can be more useful, and it can also put us in a position of being like, well, what kind of habits, actions, verbs do we want to be applying to what we're doing? So yeah, it's I think if it could be, if glossed over, it could be read as this sort of base relativism or like subjectivism, but it's not that. It's just saying that, you know, maybe just if you're less essentialist about ontology and what gets to exist, and realize that these things come about through social organization and collective activity, they're nonetheless true. It doesn't make them sort of airy-fairy and relativist. It just means it takes more work, and it means reckoning with power.
Right. Yeah, it's neither relativist nor some transcendental out there or empirical, just simple thing that exists in the world, but it exists through us in our relations to each other, right?
Yeah, nailed it.
It's good stuff. It's so fun.
You talk a lot about violence and Antifa and protests throughout the whole book, and I wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit more about the kind of unpacking your sort of dismantling of the popular, like, liberal discourse in mainstream media and so on about, violence, counter-violence, and confronting the problem of fascism and where sort of conventional understandings go awry.
Sure, absolutely. And, I've been writing about the kind of old canard of violence versus non-violent tactics in protest for a really long time, not just when kind of Antifa versus, like, neo-fascists became big kind of news objects. So a few things, and, like, mainly when I address this, it's about picking apart and challenging mainstream liberal media frameworks and locations of violence. So first of all, I think outright decrials of violence of any type, anything that gets called violence, obviously does this problematic collapsing of values to say that, anti-fascist counter-violence makes anti-fascist activists as problematic as neo-Nazis is obviously, like, a really dangerous stance to take up. It kind of completely makes void that there is something more violent about having a genocidal white supremacist outlook than being opposed to that by any means necessary. So that's, like, kind of one overarching part of it. Another aspect is what kind of activity gets called violence. So in a lot of protests that are named violent, according to kind of state delineations that the media then parrots, breaking a Starbucks window is violence. Setting a trash can on fire is violence. I'm not saying that there's no such thing as violence against inanimate objects. For example, the desecration of a synagogue by neo-Nazis. That's a violence that has a victim. But I'm not sure chain bank windows, unless you're kind of the state mind that corporations are people too, should count as acts of violence with victims who we would consider victims of violence. So that's one thing. And when the media uses that framework, the state's logic around violence and property damage, it's a really terrible way of enabling the sort of repression that uprisings like we saw in Ferguson and Baltimore receive, because property damage and rioting is considered senseless when, of course, it is not. And then there's the other point I like to make, which is when you're talking about protests, particularly when there are clashes with police or clashes between fascists and Antifa, there's this media phrase that's so common, which is the kind of the protest turned violent, or the protesters turned violent. And I have a big problem with this violent turn, which so often places the kind of instigation of violence on the Black Lives Matter protesters. If you are in a state of affairs where young Black people, or even all Black people, are just being killed by the state, by cops, at point blank range with impunity, and you have to say it all that Black Lives Matter, then we've got a background state of violence. So, the idea that the protesters turned to violence to me, ignores that like violence was the undergirding state of affairs. Same with if you've got neo-Nazis freely chanting blood and soil, this is a background state of violence. So, we shouldn't mislocate where the violence emerges. And so, if we're talking about a violent interaction with police, you're talking about a counter-violence. And I think that's important. I like to use the word counter-violence. And, this is not also like my brand new idea. Angela Davis made this point really well in the 70s when people asked her about, do you condone violent protest? And she's like, when you have to live with constant brutality and violence put upon you by virtue of the color of your skin and the kind of location of your community, she said it makes no sense to ask, do I condone violence or not? So I think those are kind of a few of the main arguments that I think are worth always thinking when you read a kind of news story that uses the term like violent protest, which is also not to say that I think there's no room for lots of like non-violent political action or what gets deemed non-violent political action that can get the goods too. Like, it's not that every single protest has to be physical, confrontational, or even relating to property damage. Like, you just have to realize what you're trying to potentially achieve with a given protest action. And I'm truly like against the idea that people should be thrown under the bus because they see grounds for property damage or militant confrontation, because those things have also earned a lot of victories in the history of struggle.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And as you say, on the other side of the equation, the cops and the criminal justice system apply a stupendous amount of violence constantly throughout the country. You have an essay about the Standing Rock protests, and there's all those pictures of all these rural police departments, which have been given MRAP mine-resistant vehicles that from Iraq, and like these bear claw tanks with heavy machine guns on top of them. And, there was one woman who had her arm almost blown off by like a concussion grenade and all this other horrible violence. And then, of course, the violence of like dragging someone to a prison cell or putting a tracker on their ankle and putting them in jail.
Right, and let alone kind of putting their very ability to like live, breathe, and survive on land at risk by by virtue of the pipeline in the first place.
Yes.
Like the police violence there and the kind of militarized violence there that's almost the kind of auxiliary violence to the violent cause.
Right. It's to secure the annihilation of the ability to breathe and have soil and land. It's just a secondary enforcement violence. I think that's so important. Your discussion, all the more, of counter-violence and engaging in the actual form of life, the practice of trying to set understandings of these terms is all the more important when the background assumptions implicit in the state and the media are these kind of reactionary or liberal definitions of violence that, as MLK pointed out in his Vietnam speech, right? It's great when citizens are non-violent, apparently, but when the same critique is leveled against the state in their war or in their policing, oh, no, that's not the same. That's actually strength, and that's good. So there are these logics of violence that are deployed against the oppressed, against the citizenry, and in favor of the state, that if we don't challenge them through these writings, through the actions with bodies on the streets, those definitions will be ceded to power, it seems to me.
Right, and it makes for bad solidarity when we need it. Like the idea that, one protest that, say there's a kind of black bloc protest that engages with property damage and confrontations with police. I mean, and then, so for example, the J20 the protests on the actual day of the inauguration, which led to a mass arrest. There was a black bloc of which I was marching with, what will I admit to publicly? So I was where I was present, and
you're giving us way too much credit to call us public, by the way. Thank you.
Okay, cool. To comrades only. But there was black bloc protest that was meant to be kind of disruptive on the actual day of Trump's inauguration. Picking up black bloc tactics hardly new, and there was quite a lot of property damage in DC against Starbucks and bank windows. And there was this huge mass arrest, over 300 people, lots and lots of my friends, all of whom were then facing up to 70 years worth of felony charges. It was such a kind of infirm and unjust mass arrest that after about 2 years, the government had to drop all these charges. But that's still 2 years of fear, and that's still 2 years where you're not able to be organizing or being back out, doing the activism that you want to do and you want to support. And so then the next day, you had the Women's March, which was vast and peaceful. And I'm not interested in, shitting on the Women's March. Some of its principles, that its kind of principles of purpose were radical and gave room to sex worker organizing and real feminist propositions and intersectionality. And, I think it's fine if what you want of a day of demonstrations is to bring people together, make them feel, emboldened in a moment where everyone's feeling kind of lesser and afraid, then that's great. And people can be politicized, especially young people or even old people who've never been out in the streets before, can be politicized on big kind of joyous days like that. And a number of the kind of organizers did offer solidarity and spoke out in support of the J20 arrestees. But then I saw one liberal female journalist, and I'm not just not saying her name, I actually don't remember, because she could have been one of 10 who I kind of always confuse, but just really #resistance liberal. And she tweeted, "Oh, amazing day at the Women's March, and, so proud of everyone. And, especially because no one got arrested." As if that's supposed to be this, kind of glorious thing that, you were so placid that the state didn't even have to, push back against you. And I felt that was, all the more offensive on that it was happening the very day after 300 people had been arrested.
Right. Who
were no less invested in, resistance and justice than the purported resistance fighters of the Women's March. So, those kind of things really just which side are you on?
That's right. It's a great critique of liberalism. And I'm sure she was happy to have brunch afterwards, because if Hillary Clinton was in office, we could all just go to brunch.
Exactly. I was oh God, look, full luxury automated gay communism, we'd all be at brunch all the time, okay?
Yeah, talk about privilege. But really that's the liberal problem theoretically seems to be this notion that the status quo, when quote unquote peaceful and civil, is not violent, is not problematic. And so the norm erosion is the problem, or the incivility is the problem. And it feeds into the reactionaries so perfectly. It's just an epistemological blindness because of privilege, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And that's why you make a great distinction between kind of what are parades permitted by the state. Similarly, you talk about rights discourse and the law in the state, not the appealing to the conscience of the state or doing, parades that the state allows and regulates is not going to disrupt fundamentally that violent order of the status quo.
Right. And so one of the kind of reflecting on a reported essay I do about these J20 arrests and about the legal battles that some water protectors faced after Standing Rock. I do this kind of reflective essay in the book about rights discourse, as you say. And again, it's about kind of being tactical. So if you're in court and you've been arrested and your First Amendment rights have been violated, like they were with the J20 defendants, you'd be mad not to say, you violated my rights. This is an unjust prosecution. But you have to recognize that in doing that, you are unavoidably, and that's just true, it's unavoidable, in interlocution with the state. So you have to use the state's logic. And a rights discourse is always about a conversation with a state. There is no conception of like human rights that is relevant unless it's being granted and recognized by some sort of authority. I mean, Hannah Arendt made that point that we can't really talk about rights unless we talk about the right to, who can be a bearer of the right to have rights. And that's related to recognition. And the state has to recognize you as such a bearer. So, you know, given that we live in a world of states and state power, we have to use that logic, and we should use it well. It's stupid to abandon it. We also have to protect it and stop it being attacked as it is being attacked. And it should become more and more robust. And we should have a robust understanding and conception of rights that should include economic rights, not just really limited, like, humanist rights. But, you know, if we limit our protest and our dissent to that which is enshrined in, you know, First Amendment rights, we'll have very little leeway to kind of pose a problem to the status quo we're trying to battle. And I mean, there's no right to punch Richard Spencer, but I think it's a super just thing to do. So I think collapsing rights and justice has been a kind of useful liberal trick, even if it hasn't been intentional. But I think it very much like stymies both our ability to fight beyond what is kind of state sanctioned, but also to understand the logic of rights, and to actually look seriously at the history of how neoliberalism has given us a more and more impoverished set of rights than were dreamed of by even some liberals earlier last century.
Yeah, I have a theory about this. Maybe you could tell me what you think of this, and attempting to explain why kind of liberals like Jonathan Chait or Connor Friedersdorf have been absolutely flipping their shit about leftists on college campuses, like calling, you know, Christina Hoff Sommers a big meanie head, while totally ignoring the J20 protests for the most part. You know, like, talk about, you know, missing the elephant in the room. But it appears to me as though, you know, the liberals are focused on the norms of a sort of free liberal capitalist society, you know, and it is true that, like, democracy depends on these sorts of norms, you know, and like people broadly speaking buying into the general sort of constitutional structure and so on. But any democracy like that is vulnerable to like a sort of critical mass of the population no longer believing in the system, which, you know, I mean, that's what got the Weimar Republic, basically.
Yeah, sorry.
And
no, feel free to interrupt Ryan at any point.
No. I want to listen.
But
I do it all the time. I'll feel better.
But the point being that, like, people see the right is increasingly abandoning the norms of democracy. And liberals, like, they criticize them for doing that, but it's so obvious that they don't care. And it's kind of baked into the cake now that, like, the right is just constantly committing crimes. The president's a criminal. He's going to completely ignore any sort of constitutional responsibilities, so on and so on. And so I think this, like, neurosis and this fear of confrontation gets pushed onto the left because they know that the left is more vulnerable to criticism and will feel an obligation to respond. It'd be like, oh, you're stupid, Jonathan Chait. Anyway,
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, I completely agree. I mean, the thing is, it's like, there's this, a lot of the kind of centrist liberal, and I think Jonathan Chait is like a unique idiot. So like there are people like
very special.
stupid than him who still kind of, without even maybe meaning to, uphold this mythos, because it's been so kind of jammed down our throats through so much whitewashed history of struggle and how democratic norms have been established. And lionizing of institutions without realizing that sometimes upholding institutions that protect our rights or our freedoms has perhaps sometimes taken some illiberal interventions, right? Like a great example is the Emancipation Proclamation was executive authoritarianism in a way. Like, if Lincoln had left it to a popular vote whether to sign it, it would not have happened. So I think, like, actually Astra Taylor has got a new book out called Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. And I think it's excellent in teasing out how, democracy... A lot of liberals now seem to like long for the days of November the 8th, 2016, as if like that was the moment that liberal democracy slipped away. And she kind of points out that all democratic projects and practices have always been really kind of fraught with contradictions, and some of the most expansive democratic or democratizing acts have not looked like liberal democracy. And liberal democracy itself has always been a kind of compromise. And over the past 100 years, it's increasingly just been a compromise away from anything like socialism, certainly as a way of fighting against communism and towards capitalism, without people paying attention to the kind of violences and inequalities that fostered, that no doubt had the seeds of authoritarianism and fascism therein. So longing for that sort of perfect model that's always been a compromise with compromise is problematic in and of itself, and a kind of failure of looking at like the movability of what liberal democracy has been over 100 years, last 100 years. And then I think in terms of this kind of paranoid fear of confrontation, and this kind of desire to be more critical of kind of the far left than the far right, and say, you know, you're the real fascists because free speech, that's also nothing new. Like, to call upon MLK again, in his letter from Birmingham jail, he talked about the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with you with your methods of direct action. And I mean, I think it's sort of, there's this irony that these sort of conservative liberals would so often call upon MLK as the model we're all supposed to follow. But then I'm pretty sure, I mean, if one can so speculate on what people would have been like, I'm pretty sure these kind of centrist conservative liberals would have been the problematic white moderates
That's
he
right.
invokes at the time. So, you know, it just becomes sort of irritating and exhausting and pathetic that people like Chait don't see themselves in that conservative history.
Right. No, that's spot on, it seems to me. And you'll be happy to know that, I mean, it's been great seeing you and Astra Taylor in conversation of late. She's actually the next guest on Left Anchor, so you'd be happy to know that.
Oh, yay.
Yeah, so it'll be a great
Pass it
sequence.
on. Yay.
And I love how you both talk about both the history and the future as necessarily contested. And maybe this is why the left is different from liberalism, which is so in love with the status quo and that negative peace. The left understands the need for constant struggle and constant movement and constant, not just contestation over, actual, whether it's Standing Rock and physical space or land or freeing prisoners, but the contestation over ideas. And I think it's really important to engage in So for example, these different tactics and strategies that are deployed to liberate are multifarious. And as you say, it's important to not just have, MLK and nonviolent direct action is important, but so can punching Richard Spencer in the face be important, right? And in fact, you bring up a surprising anecdote in talking to your uncle, I believe, about a number of things. But Vidal Sassoon was a Nazi puncher. Is this true?
Oh yeah. So this is I was talking to my grandfather, who's English.
Sorry. Of course. Yes.
And he told me that his father, but also he's a man of a lot of kind of myth making. So, but I'm going to hold on to this possibly being true because I want it to be. He told me that his father, who, it would add up, fought in the Second World War. My family's quite young. His father fought in the Second World War and returned for England, returned from fighting, and was a Jewish man who lived in the East End of London. And after the Second World War, there was, contrary to this kind of myth that all fascism just fell off the face of the map in 1945, there was a re-emergence of British fascism and a lot of violence and harassment and desecration of synagogues and homes by fascists in the Jewish areas of East London. And, Oswald Mosley and his black shirts were regrouping and having big rallies. And in return, these Jewish ex-service members formed essentially like a proto or like an original Antifa group. They were a kind of fighting gang who, were willing. Their idea was, their sort of slogan was "Maim, don't kill," and they used these really quite aggressive anti-fascist confrontational tactics to break up and drive away Mosley and his black shirts. It was called the 43 Group, and it kind of was based mainly around London, but had offshoots in different parts of England, and it was really, really successful at kind of shutting down the possible breathing room and space and tolerability for fascists to organize. And one of the members was a famed hairdresser, Vidal Sassoon, who passed away not so many years ago. And, in his obituaries, like the New York Times obituaries or whatever, he's lionized as kind of living the anti-fascism he felt and fighting against the kind of awful fascism that hadn't been eviscerated enough in the war. And he was so celebrated for that. But his tactics were far more kind of extreme than anything we've seen Antifa take up. I mean, they used knives, batons, knuckle dusters, and there are kind of a few, not too many, but there are, there's not a lot of space given to anti-fascist history in mainstream historians' tellings, but there are a couple of documentaries, and now these seem kind of like cardigan-wearing sweet old men, the few 43 Group members who are alive, but they don't talk with any regret about the brutality, the any means necessary tactics they used to drive away fascists from their homes, from the streets of London. And it's this classic kind of canonizing of revolutionaries and activists of the past and critiquing them in the future, which liberals find so comfortable. Like, they love being on the right side of history once it's over.
That's right.
But yeah, little known fact about Vidal Sassoon, the hairdresser. Punched lots of Nazis.
This is fascinating to me. I think Ryan agrees with me that punching Nazis is a laudable thing that helps justice. But we did, when Brad Evans was on, it was interesting because Ryan raised the point that, not at least Hitler and that instantiation of fascism was defeated through violence, or as we might call counter-violence, right? And Brad made the very good points that, sure, at that point that was required, but if you go back far enough, maybe a different world could have been achieved through nonviolent means. That's what I took him to mean. But what's interesting here is what you seem to be showing is that perhaps earlier on what's needed is quashing the uprisings with counter-violence in a way that doesn't allow them to kind of grow because of the liberal space that's protecting really their nonviolent or their violent ideology to grow in the soil of tolerance in a way. So I'm curious what your take is, and if you had a talk with Brad about that difference at all.
I mean, we haven't discussed that particularly. I feel like, that one can make a kind of benign but like true point that if we built a world where people are nourished and live more communally and aren't starving, segregated, caged, resentful, organized through racial difference, organized through borders, then the kind of need that, like the kind of production of violence that then demands a counter-violent response to quash it wouldn't. But I'm like, okay, sure, like that is like, yes, true. Like I don't. If Brad's point is people aren't essentially violent, like sure, but like I don't really think people are essentially many things. Like we've got a set of structures that exist now and like kind of hierarchies and set kind of modes of oppression that are really entrenched and have been whispering through histories of power and monarchies and class war, and I think these things aren't easily undone, and I don't think will be politely undone. So I'm sort of less interested in pointing out humanity's innate potential goodness compared to arguing some Burkean like war all against all blah 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 nastiness. It's more interesting of like what do we need now and how do we historicize? What kind of histories do we take up and learn from, and which do we let be silent? I mean, there's very little. I just read Enzo Traverso's book, New Faces of Fascism, which I like a lot, but I'm not like completely on board with all of it, but like there's a lot of use to it. It's also a Verso book. And he makes the point that, most post-war fascist historians have given very little room to anti-fascist history. Like there's not a lot of space given to the work really done by, partisans. There's a lot of work done about like bystanders and stretcher carriers in Vichy France. But like that, they can't be the only heroes of history. And in the same way, my friend Molly Crabapple wrote a beautiful thing recently for the New York Review of Books about the often overlooked history of the Jewish Bund in Poland and beyond, and how the kind of, predominantly anti-Zionist communist organizing that, was hugely powerful and really large at a certain point has largely been written out of Jewish resistance history. And she's Jewish and I'm Jewish, so it's like we're allowed to be anti-Zionist.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Everyone is. Anyway, that's a different conversation.
For sure.
It does feel like the last few, weeks and months have been a pretty clear example of how fascism comes to power, because, as you're sort of gesturing to in your essays, fascism is not a logical or even particularly compelling ideology for like a solid majorities. Like Hitler never got, even with like massive electoral repression, more than I think 37.5% of the vote, something like that. But what they do have is energy and organization and propaganda. And when you have that plus the connivance of conservative elites who fear the left more than they fear fascists, and you have the timidity of traditional liberals who won't, stand up to them. Watching, today, the entire Republican Party standing absolutely lockstep behind Trump, while Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are just like tying themselves into knots, trying to avoid confronting him directly with some sort of impeachment inquiry. I mean, it's not, I don't think Hitler's going to, launch a nuclear war with China or something, but like, you see how it happens,
Yeah, and I think, sorry, carry on.
No. You're, yours.
Yeah, no, completely. And it's like, and we don't need to say like, it's 1920s and 1930s Europe to see the way hateful, authoritarian, power desiring desires get fostered and calcified through collectivities and then into more electoral spaces, and how convergence from what used to be the center-right, then, and the far-right with fascistic habits, tendencies, elements happens so easily. We're seeing that in America, certainly, and across Europe. And the way in recent generations that certainly what counted as the left was essentially this bereft technocratic neoliberalism that also didn't provide any sort of nourishing alternative. So the job of the left to really provide better alternatives is ever more important, and that and remains really, really quashed, and labor unions are decimated, even though workers' struggle continues, and Nancy Pelosi's a fucking pussy, and sorry, not supposed to use that language, are we?
You're allowed to use any language you want on this podcast.
Yeah, it's sort of gendered insults, not so good. But yeah, and then you have kind of ridiculous statements like from people like horrible Joe Biden, who's like, if I become president, I'm pretty sure that the Republicans will get really into compromising, which is. And I think you've kind of got two ways of reading that. Like, either he's just really dim and naive, or he's actually really not troubled by this fascistic status quo and the fact that the Republicans won't bend and that the Republicans and the right will keep winning. And I think he's more invested in the status quo than he is an idiot. So, like, those are the questions we have to ask, too, about, especially in the realm of realpolitik, being who is really, like, opposed to this further shift right, given that it doesn't, as fascism never has, run counter to capitalism.
Right. It's born of it and part and parcel of it. I think that's a important point you make throughout, which is that fascism isn't just a historical moment. It's like Trump was elected, fascism arrived, or it's come back. And the point I think you make that's really important is that, as Foucault pointed out, fascism lives in us individually, collectively, and it's at least the potential for it is there, and we have to look out for the kind of tyrant in ourselves. And so, when you see the privilege of the Joe Bidens, who is used to sneaking up on women and sniffing their hair, and at the same time thinking he's a great guy, right? That, of course, is going to be an epistemological blindness to how oppression operates, because you've convinced yourself that all these oppressions aren't occurring. So I think when your essays are so helpful, I think, to show that all these problems are interconnected insofar as they're about how we relate to ourselves and our own tyrant, how we relate to our partners, to the state, to law, to collectivities. It's all about how we understand how to live together. And I think that's maybe you can speak a bit about your title, Being Numerous, because I think that goes to that point, right?
Yeah, I mean, the title's from the phrase, well, two words, being numerous, comes from a George Oppen poem, and he's a sort of late great poet who wrote a poem called Of Being Numerous in, I think, 68, late 60s, and it's a sort of beautiful, epic poem about, I mean, many things. It's hard to round up a poem, but a lot of it is about how kind of we become flows in a city and how we become organized and disorganized, and the phrase "we have chosen the meaning of being numerous" really kind of struck me, especially in this kind of age of mass surveillance and the way in which we're categorized as sort of civilians and organized in that sort of way. We're enumerated and we're quantified, and that's the way we almost have chosen or enabled or been forced into being numerous currently. But what would it mean to choose differently how to be numerous and how to be mass? So I kind of want to invoke the idea of mass movement, togetherness, collectivity, multitudinousness, but also use that phrase to point out that the current mode of being numerous is atomized and individuated, and we might want to choose the meaning differently.
That's beautiful, comrade. I really appreciate that.
Thanks.
I had, let's see, maybe one more topic to bring up. Returning to the Standing Rock protests, one thing that jumped out at me and sort of ties in with our previous discussion is the issue of climate change, and also the spills that these pipelines tend to produce. So this, people maybe have kind of forgotten this, but the Standing Rock protests happened. They started in 2016 when Obama was president, and this was just one of literally thousands of pipelines that were built under the Obama administration. I mean, he boasted in a debate with Mitt Romney in 2012 that they had built enough pipelines to wrap around the entire planet as part of the all of the above energy strategy, which has made the United States the biggest producer of oil and gas in the world, ahead of Saudi Arabia even. And, so you have this, on the one hand, tearing out all of these flammable carbon fuels that are, causing right now extreme weather and rising sea levels and a host of other disasters, even earthquakes in Oklahoma and elsewhere. And, predicted to, according to the science, do much, much worse than that in the future. And then on the other hand, as you point out, there was a spill in November 2017 at 210,000 gallons of oil. I think the worst spill in the history of the Midwest, at least, is this famous or infamous the Dilbit spill in Kalamazoo in Michigan, I think, right? Yes. And this was 1 million gallons, and not just oil, it's diluted bitumen. So it's this sludge stuff that they get from tar sands, and you can't pump it unless you inject it full of like benzene and other shit, and it has to be pumped under high pressure, so when there was a leak, it spewed all over the place and just completely just wrecked this entire little community. So, I mean, sort of tying that, I feel like you do a good job tying that all together in this senseless pursuit of profit and just the violent beating down of anybody who tries to challenge this logic that's literally strangling human society and animal and biological society throughout the planet.
Yes, sorry, I was like, is it more of a comment than a question? No, it's cool. I really like when there's like Q&As and people are like more of a comment than a question, I'm like, okay, cool, that's good. I don't like, I've said enough.
So thank you for that. That was good. Yeah.
No, I agree. I also, but to talk of, the mass violence of environmental degradation, we're in a, it's heartening to see energy, especially like real political energy, around something like the Green New Deal, and I'm pro that. But there was a very good essay recently, and I'm to my shame, don't remember the author, but it was in the excellent Commune magazine, pointing out that just replacing all the energy for production that we have now with green, sustainable energy will not be sufficient to sort of to solve the kind of global problems and decimations we're facing, and so much the suffering that isn't just about carbon burning. We have to change modes of production and how they're organized and run and owned. So I think, thinking the Green New Deal is sufficient rather than necessary and insufficient is crucial, but I'm glad these kind of things are on the table. But then I'm also glad we've got voices from further left than sort of mainstream democratic socialism pointing out the kind of bigger problems of living on this planet with any sort of like equity and dignity.
Well, there's a question though. If the Green New Deal isn't sufficient, and as I read that, I forget the name of that guy too, but I know the essay you're talking about. He seems to be suggesting that just like any high standard of living and like use of resources and energy is sort of untenable. So like, what's the answer?
I don't know if it's sort of like high standard of it depends what you mean. I think kind of the examples he gives is like a new iPhone every 2 years, and that like things are organized, that companies like Apple organize their iPhones such that we need 2 iPhones every 2 years, and that they get away with doing that because of the way the means of production are organized. The amount of consuming we do, and I think not all of us consume equally. Of course, some people consume very little and can only consume very little. I think it's the kind of argument when people are like, oh, so you want everyone like living in grey sludge on the omnibus. And it's like, no, I just think like there are definitely kind of excesses in types of production of certain things that don't serve really any of us, don't even really make rich people happy. And,
no, they're miserable.
Right, and so like these are the sort of things that like a broken down, remantled, communized set of social production and material production perhaps not so interested in the accumulation of profit, wouldn't be producing, and like nor should we. I think the kind of thrust of that essay is like, while thinking of remaking the economy along green, sustainable lines, that surely the dream isn't to keep everything exactly the same, but just powered by green energy. Of course not.
That's right. No, and because you make a great point about desire throughout, and capitalism, as Foucault shows, right, shapes our desire. And do we really want what we think we want? Do we really truly authentically desire that new iPhone every 2 years? So it's not just, as you say, changing even distribution or changing these different ways that we do energy, but, and I think this is why your essays are so important, our very ability to access who we are, who we want to be, what we desire, as opposed to what capitalism is pushing on us to desire, right? That itself will probably get rid of the need to overconsume in these ways that are problematic, I would hope.
Sure, and that can't be done individually, right? It doesn't help just sitting around being like, I will self-evolve in this sort of neoliberal way. It's like, what? Ooh, no, absolutely. I will find peace and go to a silence retreat. I mean, like, go do that if you want, yes. Fine. But like, it's about... Yes. What about generating like different collective desires and ways of like surviving and living and challenging the status quo of how that is organized, which does take like material activism and work, not just like,
yes,
like to shift desires entails shifting material conditions, right? It's not just like,
that's right,
kumbaya, hold hands, think about it stuff.
No, I've had students who, when they finally engaged in activism, that effectively changed both epistemologically their understanding of the problems, but also gave them that solidarity and those desires that were new in order to fight the regime and seek a more communal life, to stop being numerous and to start being really communist and collectivist and united. So I think it's a beautiful vision.
Yeah. Good.
Well, thank you, Natasha, for joining us and sharing all this with us. And you're always welcome to come back anytime and talk about punching Nazis or anything else you'd like to talk about. So yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, awesome. It was so nice. Thank you. And have a nice chat with Astra. That'll be great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The book is Being Numerous. Is it out now?
It's out now. So it's Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life, and it's out with from Verso Books. And they have a direct order thing from their website. All bookshops. It's in bookshops.
Cool. We'll put that
Wonderful.
link in the description.
Awesome. Okay.
Well,
Thanks
Thanks for coming on.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.